Hi guys, this is Ricardo Berman from Zero Infinity Productions, beerbomheadshots.com. Here I am with a tutorial on how to expose to the right with the Canon DSLRs using the Magic Lantern Raw hack. Now, this is an amazing hack for this camera. The fact that you can shoot 13 stops of dynamic range with 14-bit color is outstanding. It really is amazing. But anyway, not talking about that today. We're talking about exposing to the right. So I initially set up my camera in this high dynamic range setting where we have pretty dark blacks and pretty high highlights. And when I first exposed it and I looked at my zebras, all these areas were totally overexposed, right? So I was like, oh my God, this is like, I need to bring the exposure down. So I used my ND filter and I brought it down and I ended up with something like this. So now there was nothing burnt, which is what makes sense, so that your highlights are not completely burnt out and you can use your highlights, which are really hard to recover, if at all, when you're shooting with the DSLR. They usually clip out and they look like crap because it's digital and it's just like pure white and there's no highlight roll-off like film. So if you want to make your footage look more filmic, you really want to keep those highlights under control. Now, with this example, I was also using what the Magic Lantern has, which is the exposure to the right aid in the histogram. And you can see that within the histogram, Raw Histogram functions. Now, here it's telling me I can expose 1.6 stops to the right. So I could really increase my exposure by 1.6 stops to get the best use of the histogram. If I do that, I end up with this, which basically gives me overexposed areas, which means I would lose detail. Not good, but here I can still push it 0.1 of a stop to the right and be within the range. So I wanted to test and see what difference in quality that made. Should I listen to my zebras or should I expose to the right? Okay, now bear in mind you gotta be careful with this technique and you gotta always give yourself a little margin, because if you're shifting your camera and panning around in documentary style kind of filmmaking, you're gonna eventually blow out your highlights and you might not be able to recover them. But here we go with this example. We have this clip which corresponds to this exposure where I got rid of my zebras, and we have this clip which corresponds to this exposure, which is exposed to the right, but with my zebras telling me that I'm clipping out. My zebras, by the way, are set up at 99%, so it is really clipped out. If I go to my color tab now in DaVinci Resolve, okay, so we're here with this clip, and what we have here is we have this fairly dark clip, but with no overexposure in the building. The colors are pretty true, you know. All we gotta do is we gotta set this clip to Blackmagic Film, which is the color space that the Canon DSLRs work best at, and we can see a waveform. It's pretty much from the middle down, pretty concentrated on the low underexposed area. If we click our highlight recovery, there's no change here and there's no change in the building. Okay, so that's fair, you know, we can work with this. We could probably tweak the exposure around, which we'll do in a second, and try and recover some of the information here in the darks. If we go to this other clip, we're gonna set it up the same. We're gonna go to the Blackmagic Film, okay? Now, if you see this, it's already showing a lot more information above the center line. And these areas look clipped. It's like the information was just clipped there. It was lost. And that probably corresponds to the building here and some of that as well. You know, basically the areas that our zebras were telling us that they were overexposed. And to be honest, it all kind of looks a little washed out when compared to this. It has a lot more color, a lot more definition in the clouds, more definition in the building. So this looks kind of washed out. But if I click the highlight recovery function here, that kind of brings a lot of that detail back in. And it expands our waveform. Okay, so just for illustration purposes, let's look at this waveform here. And let's make it a little bigger. Okay, so if we toggle that on and off, the highlight recovery, look at the way it affects it there. And also look at the information that comes back in the buildings and the sky and so on. It's pretty astonishing. We get a lot more highlight information. So let me close that for a second, and let me now try and match the exposure of these two shots, okay? I feel like this is way too dark to start with. This is practically unusable, but you know, hey, it's raw, we can push it up and we can bring it up. Let's try and match the exposure of this. Although the shadows are a little dark, so let me bring them up a little bit. I'm just gonna bring them up to about there. You know, we're getting some information. That looks nice. You know, it's not, again, I'm not trying to do a color correction exercise or like really push this into white clipping or, you know, match my darks or anything. It's just an approximation of some workable footage that I can then color correct. If I try to do the same with the other clip, okay, and I'm trying to bring the shadows up, it's not really going to work too well. They look kind of washed out. It's not what we want to achieve. So we have to bring up the exposure. So bring up the exposure, okay, and we see that that's also like bringing up our highlights. So this waveform looks a little more contrasty, so I would probably just bring down the highlights a little bit just to match our waveforms in between shots. Okay, and I do need to bring my shadows up a little bit, so I need to bring those guys up and just, yeah, that looks pretty similar, right? Not bad. Okay, now, purpose of illustration is not to show you how to color correct the footage, but to see what happens to the footage when you do this. Now, if I bring this clip real big, you're gonna see that this clip has a lot of noise going on in your shadows. I'm gonna play it for you. It's a lot of movement, you know, it's almost looking like H.264. The highlights are fine, you know, there's not a lot of stuff going on in the highlights, but the shadows look pretty gnarly, and you know, I would like to add grain in post if I wanted it to. I don't want to have it in the footage standard, or otherwise I'm gonna have to spend some time cleaning it up. Now, if I look at the other clip, the one that was exposed with the zebras burnt out, look at how clean that tree looks like and how clean my shadows look in comparison. And if I play it, you know, there's just not that much grain and aliasing going on, you know. I just find this to be a much cleaner footage that I can play with in the in post. That's the one. Look at the bikes, the floor there, all the blacks, they just don't look as clean. Now, why is this? And why should we listen to our histogram when exposing these cameras instead of our zebras? Well, the reason is that when we expose to the right, we can, hold on, there we go. Let me see, where am I? When we expose to the right, we're basically going to get this histogram that is going to show us, where are you? Open up, there we go. Okay, this histogram is going to show us what levels of information we capture. So when we push our image to the right, exposure to the right, it basically means that we're focusing on the histogram in this section, right? Instead of this section. Now, in this section, there's all these different tonal values being captured. 2004, 2048, from here to here, 1024. So that's over 3,000 tonal values just in the upper section. And the lower section doesn't even get to 1,000. So we're capturing 3 times more information in 2 sections of the histogram than we are in the lower 3. If you add some of that middle area, that gives us a lot more compared to the bottom. You could almost, if you expose too dark, you could almost be just exposing with 400 or so tonal levels. And when you, basically, that gives you the level of information that you have in each image. If you expose to the right, your images are going to be slightly larger. You're going to consume a little bit more data, but it's at least going to give you better quality to that footage, as we have seen with this example. Let me toggle in between those again. Okay? So, listen not to your zebras that tell you this is overexposed and bring your exposure down, but listen to your exposure meter that has the exposure aid to the right that's telling you to go more to the right, even if you're clipping areas that show as white clipping. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, guys. Check me out, subscribe if you like it, and we'll see you soon with some other resources. And we'll see you soon with some other tutorials.